Let's let a pack of dogs out.
Hello, my name's David Kaye, owner of David Kaye's Kaye-Nine Training School, where high performance is commonplace. And today we're very proud to bring you the first of our free videos in a free video series with episode number 1 entitled In the Beginning. And the sole purpose of our videos is to bring you unbiased, time-tested, proven methods, techniques for working, communicating, training, and rehabilitating dogs. I believe that if you're given the same facts that I learned, that you'll make the same decisions that I did when it comes to what's the most advanced and what's the proper training methods to use for you and your dog. Because we know very distinctly there's 3 distinct and different schools of dog training, and they all hate each other because they all think they're right. If you take 3 dog trainers and put them into a room, they'll agree on one thing and one thing only, that the other trainer is wrong. With this kind of a backdrop, how are you supposed to receive unbiased, time-tested, proven method? The answer? You're not. Our sole purpose is to change that. Because in the beginning, when I started dog training 30 years ago, there was really only 2 old schools of dog training. You had old school pleasure, and you had old school compulsion or pressure training. And for obvious reasons, what did everybody gravitate to for the last 30 years? Of course, pleasure training. Food-based, force-free, non-averse, positive reinforcement. Is there anything wrong with pleasure training? No, absolutely nothing. We use the same pleasure they do. But here's where I find you run into trouble. When it's all you use, and your dog has drive. Now, we define drive simply as a dog that scores above average on any 1 or more of the 6 scales. We've got play drive, that's chasing toys and inanimate objects. Prey drive, that's chasing a heartbeat. Food drive, defensive drive, insecurity, and energy level. As soon as you're above average on any of those, and you use pleasure only for training, you get what I affectionately call a yeah-but dog. That's a situationally trained dog. Knows when to listen, when not to listen. Very rarely listens when it doesn't want to. Yeah, my dog's really good, but as soon as I hear but, it really disqualifies everything said before, because but is a drive issue. And we know from experience that drive issues don't get better, they get worse, because we know they never stay the same. What makes a drive issue get better or worse? Simply stated, the owner's ability to effectively communicate. So old school pleasure doesn't get the performance that we want when we have high drive dogs. If you look at the opposite, old school compulsion, well, that's pressure training. That's the mean stuff. We all know one of those trainers. That's the do it because I told you so school. We put you in a losing situation and essentially use pressure or physical markers to train it out of you. And while for some dogs that's okay, for many it's not. Insecure, sensitive dogs don't do well with pressure, old school training. Many aggressive dogs, as soon as you get more aggressive with your handling, will escalate their aggression and bite. So clearly old school compulsion, while it had some advantages, was not the long-term answer. So if we're not using old school pleasure, but yet we're using lots of pleasure, if we're not using old school compulsion, but yet we're using compulsion, what are we using? Essentially what we're doing is we're evolving and taking the best of both of the old schools. The best of old school pleasure was what? Happy dog. Best of old school compulsion? Well, a dog learned it had to have manners and listen even when it didn't want to. So the 21st century question that I tried to answer was, how do you get a dog to have manners and listen when it doesn't want to without being mean? Welcome to the third school. We call it balanced training, performance in exchange for pleasure, advanced marker training. It's all the same thing. And essentially it involves knowing what a dog likes and in what order, having it available, same positive reinforcement that everyone else is using. But the idea is once you know what to do to get what you want, I got to start to get you to do it when you don't want or least expect. Gradually raise the pressure and distraction while it ever going dominant, keeping a balance of pleasure for performance. Desensitizing location, line, and collar, those aren't reasons that you listen. Keeping a balance of pleasure for performance as you increase the distraction level and extend the distance by which we get the dog to listen. Now, in order to understand balance training as it relates to pleasure training or old school compulsion training, you have to have a basic understanding of some of the simple science. The simple science of operant conditioning, the same operant conditioning that was discovered by Edward Thorndike and studied in the late 1800s, and further studied by B.F. Skinner in the early 1900s. And operant conditioning, essentially, all learning theory relates back to it. Every theory that we train dogs or humans with, every learning theory relates back to operant conditioning. And it states that we as humans and dogs understand that our behavior has an effect on our environment, and that good things and bad things can happen to us based on our behavior. And the four squares of operant conditioning, we have positive reinforcement, we have negative reinforcement, we have positive punishment, and we have negative punishment. Reinforcers are simply used to increase a behavior, punishers are used to decrease a behavior. Positive means we're adding something, negative means we're taking something away. So within the context of operant conditioning, if we analyze all three of the training schools, let's start with the old school pleasure. Which squares are they typically using of the four operant conditioning squares? They're using two. They're using positive reinforcement, and they'll use negative punishment. Positive reinforcement is they're using food once you do a behavior. Negative punishment is I'm withholding something of value to decrease a bad behavior. Most commonly, we're withholding attention or withholding food. And with the dogs I work with, high drive, high energy dogs, I can't tell you the last time turning my back on a high drive dog worked in trying to get it to stop jumping. It's a gradual process and often doesn't work at all with high drive dogs, and you get yeah, but dogs. If you look at old school compulsion, that's the mean stuff. And they're using what? They're using positive punishment, negative reinforcement. Now, the pleasure trainers will go as far as to make these two boxes green and these two boxes red. And they'll tell you, don't ever use negative reinforcement because you can harm the dogs. Well, while it might be true, it's not giving credit to the fact that someone might have ninja leash skills or can teach those ninja leash skills, because clearly we have a more advanced way to communicate. Because with balance training, we're not using the two green squares and we're not using the two red squares. We're actually using all four squares depending on the dog. And more particular, what we're really focusing on is 80% of the time we're in two squares. Positive reinforcement green, negative reinforcement, specifically escape avoidance. By combining these two, wow, welcome to the Magic Kingdom. That's where we get happy dogs that listen and have manners even when they don't want to. The idea is, every time you jump, I tap you on the shoulder. Every time you have 4 feet on the ground, you get pleasure. It doesn't take a dog very long to figure out which behavior gets pleasure or which one doesn't. Eventually, you learn to avoid that tap on the shoulder altogether. For a performance command, it's different. I give you a chance to do it first because it's not a bad manner. If I say sit, I give you a free command. If you don't do it, I start to tap you on the shoulder. Eventually, what turns those taps on the shoulder off? The act of sitting. If I pleasure that immediately, then the dog learns to escape those taps. Next time, what do you think happens? Smart dogs escape quicker and go right to the pleasure. So the idea here is if I have really good leash skills, negative reinforcement, escape avoidance very specifically, and I pair it with the same positive reinforcement that all the pleasure trainers have been using for the last 30 years, and I pleasure what I want, and I negative mark clearly what I don't want, all of a sudden we get dogs responding at a very, very different level. When we talk about using positive and/or negative reinforcement, we have to differentiate between think training and performance training, and they're very different. Think training really refers to the electives. You talk about agility, you talk about dock diving, fly ball, fit pause, much of the scent work. That's all electives. That's all think training. There's no negative reinforcement in think training. We're using pleasure, primarily food. We're luring and molding, and we're teaching behaviors that are specific, and no negative reinforcement is used. It's very important to differentiate think training from performance training. Performance training is whereby a dog has to have manners and listen even when it doesn't want to. That's where our negative reinforcement comes into play. And as long as we're keeping a balance between our positive reinforcement and our negative reinforcement, we get a happy dog that performs. Too much performance, not enough pleasure, we get an unhappy dog. Too much pleasure, not enough performance, we get a spoiled dog. So there's an elusive balance, and it's different for every dog. And so that's how specific the leash work becomes in training. With balance training, what we do is during an evaluation, we get to know the dog intimately, what they like and in what order. And we have it with us at all times. Food, reassurance, a toy, or another dog are the primary reinforcers. Now, instead of giving these to you for free, like the average pleasure trainer might, instead we're going to use them to teach you what it is you need to do to get that which you value. We call it performance for pleasure. Instead of giving you what you like for free, have manners and listen in exchange for it. That's normal positive reinforcement. Once you know what to do to get what you want, however, then we can start to make you do it when you don't want, or least expect, gradually raising the pressure and distraction at which you succeed, never going dominant, keeping a balance of performance in exchange for pleasure as we raise the distraction level. Eventually we can desensitize location, line, and collar, rendering those three things irrelevant. Extend our distance from 4 feet out to 15 feet, and then eventually to off-leash. When balance training, we're using positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement, and it's negative reinforcement that's very misunderstood. And the fact is, we as humans, every day of our lives, we learn from positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. We make decisions based on both. Last time you had an interview in Boston at 9:30 and you showed up at 10 o'clock because of traffic, what'd you do next time you had an interview? You woke up earlier. That's a behavioral change due to negative reinforcement. You learned how to avoid the bad outcome. If you're learning by positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement every day of your life, shouldn't your dog have the same opportunity? We believe so. But again, if negative reinforcement is used improperly, I agree, it can cause damage. So we have to teach very good leash skills in using it. And the tools become very, very important. And it's important not to judge the tools, but rather to judge the training, because anybody can misuse a tool. If I take a bag of nail and hammer with wood and I give it to a really good carpenter, chances are I'm going to get a very nice house. But if I give the same bag of nail and hammer to a convicted felon, they'll break, maim, and destroy with the same bag of nail and hammer. So we don't judge the bag of nail and hammer, rather we judge who's using it. And the same thing is true with our training tools. Whether it be a prong collar, a remote training collar, a gentle leader, a choke collar, a martingale collar, it's not the tools, it's the training. And we have to use the tools that are appropriate for the specific drive profile of our dog. Our tool of choice is a prong collar. Now, a lot of people make assumptions as soon as they see a prong collar. Oh my God, those spikes, you're going to put it on my dog? And already we have people making assumptions. They're judging tools instead of training. My initial goal with every dog when they come in is to gain their trust, build rapport. I do that with value, food, reassurance, toy, or another dog. What would happen if I went prong down on a dog I barely knew, let alone an insecure or sensitive dog, and I overmarked or overcorrected the dog at the beginning of that relationship? What do you think it would do to that relationship? Of course, the dog wouldn't trust me anymore. So do you think we start prong down on any dog? Never. We flip it. Wait a second, I didn't know you could use it that way. That's why we don't judge tools, we judge training. And I've never met a dog, no matter how sensitive or insecure, which many of the dogs are, that could handle that as their first physical marker. What do you get a physical marker for? Jumping, pulling, barking excessively, growling, or biting, or not listening to one of our 4 performance commands on the first requests. Come on, heel, sit, and lie down. Off-leash recall is separate. So essentially what we're doing is every time you jump, we're giving a tap on the shoulder with an off command. Every time you got 4 feet on the ground, you're getting yes, pleasure. Every time you pull, you get easy. Every time you're not pulling, you feel off-leash. Every time you bark excessively, easy. Every time you're calm, loose, 4 feet on the ground, we're creating pleasure. It doesn't take a very smart dog to figure out very quickly which behaviors get pleasure and which behaviors don't. But if you're not tapping them on the shoulder and you're punching them in the face instead, your dog doesn't figure out how to escape and avoid. It panics, it flees. So it's very imperative that you have good loose skills, and that's what we focus on teaching people. We're going to go through how we use a prong collar as part of balance training, what we use as escape avoidance, negative reinforcement. We pair it with positive reinforcement. And it's important not to judge the tool, but rather the training, because obviously we can make prejudgments about tools, and we can certainly use tools incorrectly and cause harm. But tools used well, we get a very, very different result. This is a Herm Sprenger stainless steel prong collar. It's the only brand of collar that I use. We don't even use the chrome-plated ones anymore. There's 2 problems with the chrome-plated ones. There's nickel in them, so we get many thin-skinned dogs that get allergies to the nickel. And if they have light color fur, that nickel turns it gray. So we stopped using the chrome-plated ones and went solely with stainless, and we just happen to like the black stainless. Now, when we start working a dog, we don't start prong down, we start with a smooth side. And that really functions a lot like a martingale. In fact, it's no different than a martingale. And I've never met a dog, no matter how sensitive or insecure, that couldn't handle that as a physical marker to start. But it's important to understand that with most dogs, the collar flips. It doesn't mean the dog is bad or that we're being mean. It's just a function of the level of tap on the shoulder required to affect the future instance of why we're tapping you. So a physical marker isn't meant to be mean. It's not meant to hurt the dog. It's meant to mark a specific behavior with just the right amount. Little as possible, much as needed without ever going over. Less than needed doesn't affect the behavior that you're marking. More than needed puts your dog into shutdown or flee mode. So you really have to have good control of your leash in order to get the proper tap. And we get feedback from the dog as to what that is. The goal, again, is to never overmark the dog and always create a pleasure marker for the opposite behavior so the dog can learn how to avoid the taps on the shoulder. So what we do, PJ, why don't you come on up and you can help me out for just a second. PJ is going to play the dog for me for just a second. This is the dog. That's the head. That's the tail. Good boy, PJ. So what we're going to start off with is a smooth side prong. Goes over the dog's neck. From the moment I connect my leash to my collar, my sole purpose is very different than most people. My sole purpose when I connect my leash is to make PJ, my dog, feel free, happy, most importantly of all, off leash at all times that is connected to my leash. Just like he feels right now. The reason PJ feels off leash right now is because there's no weight, there's no pressure on that neck with pulling of any kind. Now most people, when I ask them if that's a loose leash or a tight leash, most people will say it's loose. But at my school, that's no longer a loose leash. That's a tight leash because there's actually weight on his neck right now that wasn't there a minute ago. If I do that, PJ can feel that weight disappearing. So to me, that's weight and that triggers drive because you put it on in exactly the wrong place, wrong time, triggering what it is you didn't want in the first place. But there's a problem. Most people don't have the leash like that. They have it like that. Why don't you step back 2 steps for me and we'll stay right in the camera angle. That's a tight leash. That's pulling. That's the average person. The idea here is I'm creating an opposition reflex. The more I pull this way, what happens? The more the dog wants to pull the other way. The dog no longer feels free, happy, or off leash. How are you supposed to make the dog feel while it's connected to your leash? Free, happy, off leash, doesn't feel any of those things right now. But the fact is, I feel pretty good. I feel secure because why? I can feel my dog on the end of the leash. I got a crazy dog, he ain't trained yet, but we're coming through anyways, better look out. So the idea here is a tight leash is not for the benefit of the dog. It's for the benefit of the owner. And most of the time that tight leash is for the own insecurity of the owner needing to feel their dog on the end of the leash. So the first thing we teach anybody when they come through here, how to make a dog feel off leash even though it's not. Second, we teach people how to foster that off leash feeling for the dog without adjusting to the dog in any way. Most people without training inadvertently adjust to the dog. Here's what adjusting looks like. You're walking away, right? You stop and look, is he coming or is he going? Oh, pooing or peeing. Oh, now I'm getting pulled down the street. How will a smart dog ever learn where to be based on a normal, predictable point-to-point dog? The answer is they won't. So again, what we're doing, number one is we're making a dog feel off leash. Number two, we're able to foster the off leash feeling as we walk, point to point, normal, predictable, without adjusting to the dog in any way. But at the same time we're doing that, making the dog feel off leash, we're being ninja with our leash skills because while we're not triggering any drive, we're in a position to mark the dog if it jumps, pulls, barks, or bites, or it doesn't listen to one of our four performance commands on the first request. And after every negative marker for what we don't want, what are we responsible for? Yes, that's our verbal pleasure marker with actual pleasure following. So the idea here is we can use our advanced training, positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, to create pleasure for what we want, taps on the shoulder for what we don't want, and smart dogs very quickly learn how to avoid and escape very quickly and go right to the pleasure. That's the whole essence of a happy dog that still is going to perform even when it doesn't want to. And we're not being mean in the process. We're going to talk for a moment about the remote training collar because along with the prong collar, they're the single most misunderstood tools in dog training. And right now I got a Educator EZ900. It's a very small collar and I'm using these ultra comfort feathers. They're wires and it just makes the reliability of the collar really unbelievable. Now again, we don't judge tools, we judge training. And a remote training collar, in my estimation, is either the best thing to ever happen to your dog or it's the worst thing to ever happen to your dog. And the only difference between those two is who's using it and how they were trained. Very quickly, this becomes the worst thing ever for a dog when we use it the wrong way. And we consider using it the wrong way, using it to train your dog first. We don't train a dog with a remote collar. We transfer what we taught you to the remote. So when you train a dog with remote, you got a couple problems. You're starting off with stimulation. You don't know what level to use. The dog won't tell you, and so you're experimenting. And a lot of dogs get poisoned in the very beginning just going through that one process. So we want to make sure that we don't have to use stim when we start. Often the wrong way of using it is as what we call invisifence on the go. A person is simply taught to negative mark the behaviors they don't want. They don't pleasure very much what they do want. Most people stop using it pretty quickly because they don't feel comfortable just punishing the dog with it. And the dog gets collar smart because it listens with the collar on and very rarely, if ever, listens when the collar is not on. And sensitive, insecure dogs over-respond to stimulation when you train them with it. In most cases, it takes a lot of balance to be able to find the right amount to use with the dog. So let's turn now to the best thing ever for a dog and how we use it that way. And the primary way is that we don't train the dog with it. We go through the same process we talked about earlier. We know what you like and in what order. But instead of giving it to you for free, I teach you how to have manners and listen to some basic performance commands in exchange for the value. Again, that's normal positive reinforcement. But here's where the difference comes in. Once you know what to do to get what you want, we're going to start to make you do it when you don't want or least expect, gradually raising the pressure and distraction at which you succeed, never going dominant, keeping a balance of performance in exchange for pleasure along the way up. We're going to desensitize location, line, and collar. Those aren't the reasons why you listen. We render those irrelevant. You listen because it always gets you what you want. We extend our distance from 4 feet out to 15 feet. We got a trained dog to a long line. Looks pretty darn good. Have we touched a remote collar yet? No, we have not. Now, if you take and put a remote collar on a dog at that stage of training instead of at the beginning, you get a very, very different result. 2 amazing things happen. First and foremost, the dog already knows what this means before I ever even press a button. How is that possible? Because it already speaks the language that I taught it with a leash and a collar. Because of that one fact, 100% of our dogs, when they go on to a remote collar, 100% of them start responding to the vibration on the collar, not to stimulation. 85% of the dogs we train, however, start to desensitize to that vibration. Why? Because it's only one level of intensity. And as soon as the drive, which often happens with many of our dogs, is greater than the intensity of that vibration, well, that's when you fail. It's at that point and that point only that we put them on stimulation. Not shock, stimulation. With a good collar, 0 to 100, it's digital. I've got wire feathers. The fidelity is unbelievable. There's constant contact, and I have many dogs that respond to a 4 or 5 on this when the average human can't feel it till 18 to 23. That's incredible fidelity. And what this allows me to do is have this constant conversation with you. And the dog learns how to make a deal with you that's unprecedented in dog training. Oh my God, every time I have bad manners, I'm held accountable without fail. And oh my God, they never give a formal command without backing it up. You mean all I got to do is have manners and listen? I get anything I want? Yes, that's the deal. But if you're not willing or able to hold the dog accountable to that standard, then by definition, you're going to get a situationally trained dog, listens when it wants, not when it doesn't listen when it doesn't want, or you're going to get a collar smart dog that only listens with a remote collar on, or you're going to get an insecure dog that's going to flee in panic because it's already poisoned, what we call the invisifence effect. You have dogs that you cannot work in their yard because they're so averse to that invisible barrier that was created. That's not what we want to use STIM for. We want to use STIM to communicate, to make the deal with you. And you'll find if you use it this way, again, we get freedom, unprecedented for the dog. So now all of a sudden I've got an off-leash dog, and the only reason I got him off-leash is why? I get incredible performance from the dog. That's a pretty good deal for the dog if you think about it. Now, let's bring out Fonto. All right, so here we have Fonto. And just to reiterate some of the stuff that we do with the leash, first thing we're going to do is we're going to make the dog feel off-leash. We'll foster the off-leash without adjusting, and then we'll communicate very specific behaviors to the dog. Come on. Come on. So again, fostering off-leash, not adjusting. Come on, I'm able to change directions. The dog stays right with me. Heel. That's a different command. That's requiring the dog to take its right shoulder, make contact with me, and it's going to stay there. I'm using reassurance as the primary reinforcer right now. There it is. The dog can't leave my side till given permission. Sit. That's one free. Dog receives pleasure, food, and reassurance. Yes. Lie down. Heel. So we end up with very high performance behavior with a really happy dog. Now, I can take this off the dog. Break. So normally you'd have no way to communicate to the dog, but because the dog is already trained to a leash and collar, we're able to communicate the same way that we just did without having the leash connected. Fonto, here, heel. Yes. So right now I have him on a level 4 stimulation, which most people aren't able to feel. Heel, heel, heel. So he doesn't separate at all. He's able to keep that contact with me at all times, and I'm able to give a reinforcement for what I want, and I can tap him on the shoulder for what I don't want. Lie down. Heel. Oh, yes. Heel. I can use tempo. I can heel, 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 heel. That's the tap on the shoulder. The only way those taps stop is when the dog actually does the behavior. You can see I, with pinpoint precision, marked with pleasure what I wanted. Break. There's a release. Dog's free to do anything it wants. We can take this outside. We can take it off leash. Happy dog, free, off leash. The only reason we can do it without a fence is because we get real reliable performance.